So, for the benefit of the tape, which we didn't have last week because of a malfunction, we're exploring the actual now disciplines, spiritual disciplines, habits and practices of what it means to draw into places where we meet God intentionally and purposefully and invite God to be at work in our lives and drawing us into the depth of God's life, which is really what we desire. And knowing this, as you recall from other times together, when we know something biblically, especially in the New Testament, often that word means experience. You know, we know by doing, we know by experience. And so it's interesting that Jesus says in his prayer in John 17, you know, that this is life, that they know you and know Jesus Christ, and so forth. So knowing God is the means, or experiencing God is the means of drawing deeply into that life. And so what we're doing in these disciplines is just creating space for that to happen. And as we said last time, some of these things that we're talking about aren't meant to be permanent aspects of your life. They're just temporary moments. Now, some of them can become more permanent if you find them useful, helpful, working with you. But you're not really meant to be forever in these ways, but these are ways to temporarily create space for God. And you'll discover that once we do these things temporarily, we can do them just about any time and any place. And that's what we want. Particularly, we want to be able to do those things that we're called to do when we're called to do them, and we have the opportunity and the ability to do that without having to go through lots of preparation, lots of thought, so forth. I remember reading Chuck Colson one time was writing about having gone on a trip to visit the gulags of the Soviet Union, and he was with one of the Russian Orthodox priests or somebody in that kind of liturgical church, and so they were in a very deep part of these chambers or whatever where people had been kept, and Colson just felt compelled to pray in this moment. And so he said, "Do you mind if we pray?" And the bishop looked at him. He says, "Here, now?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, "Okay, wait." And he had to go all the way back to his office, wherever he was in that place. And then he came back with vestments and books and things like that, because the idea of praying is more of a liturgical moment for him rather than a spontaneous connection to God. And Colson just wrote that as a illustration of how, in some places prayer is simply an exercise. And I don't think he meant to disparage this guy's faith. He just said, there was a real contrast there. And what we understand to be instant communication with God wasn't as instant in that case. So what we're hoping for in the life that God is molding in us is the ability to be instant in our communion with God, so that in whatever moment we find ourselves, we will have the capacity to do whatever is required in that moment by the grace that God gives. And that's the goal of our time in these practices. So we started again, for the benefit of the tape, the disciplines of abstinence. There are the disciplines of abstinence and the disciplines of engagement. And so we started on the disciplines of abstinence, and we talked about solitude last week. And one of the points that I want to just reiterate in the idea of abstinence is that what we're doing is temporarily removing something from ourselves that is normal and sometimes even necessary for life, just so that we can create space for God to focus our attention in that time. And And so what disciplines of absence are not is punishment, or anything like that. We're not beating ourselves up for God's sake. We're simply creating space for God to fill. And so that's what we're exploring now. We talked about solitude last week, and we got to the point where we discovered some of the benefits of solitude, and we stopped with how do you do it? And it's really not hard. You have to be by yourself. That's kind of a key point, is by yourself is a part of solitude. So we looked at some of the benefits last week, but how do we do that? So what I want to recommend is that again, you begin simply. This is not the time to begin the 40-day wilderness trip by yourself. You may get to a 40-day wilderness trip at some point in your life, but don't begin with one, because that will be self-defeating. So maybe you want to devote an afternoon, maybe a hike or a spot on the lake or a river that'll allow you to be alone. And so probably Green Lake is not the place to go, because you won't be alone there. So go somewhere where you will be by yourself. Now, the other thing here is also be conscious of the people that are close to you in your life, the people that your spouse, your close friends. If you're going to someplace like really out there, let them know where you are. Because if you don't come back, they want to know where you are. And so then if they see your mantle on the ground, they'll know that you had this Chariots of Fire experience. But at any rate, go someplace alone where you can be by yourself. It doesn't have to be in nature, but nature helps. But it doesn't have to be. If you can get to a quiet place in the city, that's fine too. So a retreat center works. And we have a few of those around here. There are a few monasteries, a few abbeys that are not too far away that you could visit and use. I found when we were living in Lake Forest Park, I found right down the street in Shoreline was a small little monastery. And that was a perfect place for quiet for an afternoon. And I would go there, and they don't mind. They're cool with that. So you go in, you just sit in the chapel there. It was very nice, and it's very, very quiet, and they're respectful of that. It's not like some nun's going to come crashing in saying, "What the heck are you doing here?" They just recognize that this is what they offer, and so find some place like that. A cemetery works, now not the downtown one in Seattle where all those people are buried that people come to visit. That's probably not the good place to go. But in out of the way kind of, that's quiet typically, and lots of people don't venture into cemeteries, so you probably will not get a crowd around there. Don't take a list of things to accomplish in this time. When you're going to be by yourself with God in solitude, do not take a book to read. Don't take a journal to write in. Don't take things that you want to accomplish. Plan on simply being alone and quiet with God. And that's a key element. Because if you go with something to read or something to accomplish, then you are distracting yourself from the presence of God. Even if you're reading a book about God, you may find yourself in a moment where that still small voice of God comes up and says, "Do you understand what you're reading?" Just like Philip in the Ethiopian, right? "Do you understand what you're reading? Let me explain it to you. In fact, the book is about me." So don't distract yourself in those moments. Just don't take anything with you. See what's around you as gifts from God, as the benevolence of God, as God's charisma to you. Consider your life as a gift from God. Reflect on the idea that God is seeking you more than you are seeking God. And if you do that, then you will find the God who is seeking you. So consider that time alone as a gift itself. When you're there, center your thought on the goodness of God. allow yourself to be wrapped up in that idea. Invite the Holy Spirit to lead your thoughts that way. You may want to dwell on a particular passage of Scripture, perhaps your life verse, the thing we talked about before. Another significant portion, inviting the Spirit to reveal your desires for God in light of that Spirit. I was just reading this morning in Psalm 130. That was the rotation for today, for today's reading at the end of today's reading. But Psalm 130, you'll recognize it, the beginning of it, that says, out of the depths I cry to you, Lord, out of the depths I cry. I wait for the Lord. My whole being waits. And in His word I put my hope. I wait for the Lord more than watchmen wait for the morning. I wait. And that's an important part of this, is the waiting. And then, of course, if you sneak ahead to tomorrow's reading in Psalm 131, a portion that also counts, I have calmed and quieted myself. I am like a weaned child with its mother. We talked about this before, but the weaned child does not need anything from the mother except the presence of the mother. That's what's there. And that's what David is reflecting on, that he's content to be in the presence of God. And so this idea of waiting and seeking and being alone with God, waiting for God to be present. So that might be part of what your experience is. When you're done with your time, decide on your next appointment in solitude. Don't just wait. Just say, well, this is good. Someday we'll do it again. Make the appointment. And this is for yourself. And write it in whatever you keep as a diary or a journal or your calendar or whatever. Write it in. So that if somebody calls you and says, do you have this time available? You can look on your diary and say, actually, I don't. I don't. And if you have something written there, you're not misleading them, you're not mischaracterizing, you're simply saying, I have something planned for that time. And keep it. It's an important appointment. So this is part of the intention part. You know, we don't accomplish the things that we desire without intention and means to do them. So you can have the vision, but if you don't have the intention and the means to bring them off, you'll just be living fantasies, or you'll be frustrated and disappointed and walk away. So God is not opposed to our planning these kinds of things. God invites that. God welcomes that. So as you come out of that time, invite the Spirit to lead your thought as you reconnect with others. Remember, you've been in solitude. So now you're reconnecting back into life, a re-entry back. And invite the Spirit to lead your thought. Express thanks for the gift of God's presence and ask for increased awareness of God's presence. And this, something we sometimes maybe just assume is going to happen. But Jesus said, if you ask for anything in my name, and we talked about this before, in my name, it's not a secret formula that just guarantees, the result. That's not a tagline that says, oh, now God is obliged. In my name means everything associated with who I am. That's what it means. So when we pray in Jesus' name, we're praying about Jesus' character, we're talking about Jesus' values, we're talking about Jesus' mission, we're talking about Jesus' vision and all of that. Everything connected with the person of Jesus. So when you pray in Jesus' name, you're invoking all of that into that moment. So if you pray for anything in my name, I will do it. And so if you really want to test Jesus in this, pray about increased awareness of God. I want an increased awareness of your presence around me, God. And I ask it in the name of Jesus. For the sake of being a follower of Jesus, to be able to participate with Jesus in what Jesus is doing in the world. And that is a prayer that God delights to answer. And you will discover an increased awareness of God in your life. And you will sense that. And you will begin to hear God in that way. Remember, Jesus said, none of this is in my notes either. That's why we're always so far behind. Because you just always take us to places that I don't plan for. But John chapter 10, Jesus, talks about being the good shepherd. Right? And what is one of the distinctives of the good shepherd? My sheep follow me because what? They know my voice. They know my voice. And so the question that I would pose is, how well do you know the voice of Jesus? Have you ever heard it? And it's likely not audible, but it could be. God has been audible before with people. There's no reason why God suddenly said, well, that was, for then, but not for now. So it could very well be. I've never had that sensation, but a friend of mine has had a sense where he was in a car and was pondering something to do, and he said, a voice behind him said, do this. And it described what it was to do. And he said, I was alone in the car. So it was like, well, what else? He was praying. What do I do? Do this. So what's the next thing to do? Do that. Good idea. Let's do that. Let's do that. But how many times would we discount that? To say, well, maybe, we're like Scrooge, with Marley. Maybe you're just a piece of beef. Maybe you're just a rotten pizza that I had last night, No, when God speaks, we have to listen and follow. So express thanks for the gift of God's presence and ask for increased awareness of God's presence. And you may want to record your reflections in a journal or a spiritual diary if that's something for you. If you do that, then cool. You might want to do that. But here's a key idea that I want to leave with you before we move to silence. As you reconnect with others, bear in mind that you bring to every encounter or engagement the gift of God's presence to it. Christ in you. You bring Christ into every relationship, every encounter, every situation in which you're in, and that you, in that moment, are the vessel of God's blessing to that person, to that moment, to that issue, to that circumstance. Christ in you. You are the presence of God in that moment. John talks about this in his chaplain work, and I experienced that in my chaplain work too. They talk about the ministry of presence. You don't have to say anything, but you being the chaplain, you bring the presence of something divine, something even people can't always name, but they know, they sense. And I've had officers say this, and I'm sure John has too. They say, the room changes. The atmosphere in the room changes when you show up. And I don't say anything spectacular. And neither does John. They teach us mostly to be quiet and listen. Because the idea is you bring a sense of calm because there's a higher sense, there's a higher kind of rest that people seek. And you represent that when you walk into the room. Even people who don't have any faith background or experience, when the chaplain shows up, they know that's something that has something to do with something bigger. And they're fine with that. Especially if you're just very warm and open to their moment of pain and not telling them how to be or what to be, but just saying, how can I be with you in this moment? What can I do for you? Because most of the time people in crisis are being told what to do, But the real help in crisis is, how can I be with you in this? And so the mission, this is all of us. Christ in us. We are all this way in the world. Every time you come into a situation, every relationship here, when you're at work, you are Christ at work. You are bringing the presence of Christ into that place, into that setting with those people. What a great privilege. And you're a vessel of God's blessing. And so we're always ready to pour out blessing. I remember blessing is wanting the good and desiring the well-being of those who are nearby. So when you bless somebody, what you're doing is you're invoking God's activity on their behalf to bring about their flourishing and their goodness and their well-being. Yes, that's.
I used to work at Stevens Hospital, which hasn't existed for a long time. It got swallowed up by another organization. But it was a secular hospital. It was an independent hospital. It wasn't a big chain. Wasn't run by Catholics or anything. Mm-hmm. We had a chaplain named, I can't remember his first name, but his last name was Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T. Mm-hmm. And he did what you are describing. Mm-hmm. The atmosphere of the whole hospital was touched by that man. And when he retired, it was like a shade fell over the hospital.
Yeah.
It was nobody could take his place like that. He didn't say much. He wasn't ebullient. He wasn't a hugger. He wasn't a talker. He just sort of soaked up stuff, and it was. People gravitated to him like nothing. It was just amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's cool. You have no idea the impact that you can make in those situations with people. You just don't. And so allowing yourself to be used in that way, but considering yourself the vessel of God's blessing in those places is an important piece. It's a good segue. So thanks, Dennis, for that. Let's move on. That's a good segue into our next discipline, which goes hand in hand with solitude, and it's silence, the discipline of silence. And so, like we said, with solitude, the secret is being alone. The secret of silence is what? Silence is being quiet. Is eliminating noise from your place. So Henry Nouwen once said that silence is the way to make solitude a reality, so you really do invite a space, or you create a space. So in silence, we close off our souls from sounds, and that's whether the sounds is noise, music, or words. We live, you and I live, in a world filled with noise. And most of what we consider quiet is really just a little less noise. So it's actually very difficult to be in total silence. I remember a long time ago when I was first in ministry, I moved to a remote, out of the place, nowhere parish to serve a church that had more hogs than people in the county. Okay, so it was one of those rural kind of church locations out in the middle of central Illinois where, I mean, they don't even know what streetlights are. And so it was like when it was nighttime, it was dark and it was quiet. And the first week I moved there, I could not sleep. Because I had moved from a suburb of Los Angeles and had lived 200 yards away from the Ventura Freeway, which has always got traffic on it all the time, 24/7. And so you just learn to live with all of that traffic noise. And so when I got to the middle of nowhere, and at night it was so quiet, it was disturbing because I was used to it. I almost considered buying a noise machine just to be able to get to sleep. That's weird, isn't it? But it shows you how accustomed we can be to noise. And I mean, you think about it. In our world, noise usually means things are happening, right? Stuff is happening. Our offices are filled with noises of machines that are whirring away, doing things that we want them to do. Our homes hum with appliances that make life easier for us. We accommodate noise because it's become the stuff of life, and we rely on that stuff that makes noise. Which is why silence can be unnerving, because it gives the impression that nothing is happening. Actually, in our world, when your home goes completely silent and quiet, something's wrong, right? What do we say? What's the first thing we say? The power is out. Really?
What are the kids doing?
Well, that's the other thing.
What are they up to now?
You see, in a household of small children, silence is a problem. Yes. And you must go seek the danger, and find out. But yes, you know what I'm saying here. So to be in silence is countercultural. We feel cut off from life when we're in silence. It just leaves us alone with God. Now, noise makes it difficult to listen. And that's true in every regard. We have to cancel out prevailing sounds to hear what someone might be saying to us, right? And so in the disciplines of silence, we're seeking true quiet that we might truly hear. And we're seeking the God who tells us in Isaiah 30, and you know this phrase, that in quietness and trust is your strength. That's countercultural, right? In quietness and trust is your strength. Even the Israelites, though, they didn't get that because they rarely, what? They were rarely quiet and trusting of God. They were often clamoring for something from God, and they were often just making lots of noise around the things of God, and they certainly didn't seem to trust God because they were always maneuvering in the background, just in case God doesn't deliver. But God always did. And this is the value of the salvation histories, that you read in the Psalms and many, many places where they rehearse the history of Israel so that the later generations will be able to say, this is how God acts. And so expect to hear from God these ways and expect to see God at work in these ways. So in quietness and trust is our strength, but that's usually not how we picture it in our culture. So we're practicing silence then for the sake of some inner quiet. Because without inner quiet, our souls become what? Disintegrated. And so we're trying to put our souls back together again. And so sound is something that can be wonderful or disturbing. It stimulates our senses. And we're wonderfully created with the capacity to interpret sound. It's amazing to think about how we can actually understand and interpret sound. It can influence our feelings for joy, for sorrow, for peace, or anxiety. I mean, it's amazing how sound can impact you that way. Sound, in the form of words, gives meaning. It informs our understanding. I mean, all we're doing in speech is agreed upon sounds, right? So if you hear somebody speaking Russian and you don't speak Russian, that's just noise, right? It's just sound. Same with anything else, any other language. It's just sound. We don't know what it is. But if we're living in an agreed upon sound, then that gives meaning to our world. But that also influences our senses. If you hear somebody in Russian calling you an idiot, does that matter?
You can sometimes tell by the way
Sometimes the way they say it can convey its meaning.
they're pointing their finger a lot.
Yeah. But you get my meaning, right? So if you don't understand what somebody's saying, it can't influence your senses. But if somebody you know, somebody you trust, somebody you love, calls you an idiot in a language you know, that's a different thing. It influences your senses, your feelings. So words can be beneficial or detrimental depending on who is speaking or in how they're spoken. If somebody that you don't care about says something to you that is debilitating or it doesn't matter. But if somebody you love says those things, it can really hurt, right? It can really hurt. So how they're well, we don't have time to go in. But we know that words can hurt. Negative speech can elicit a defensive reply. If somebody says something negative to you, your first response might be to say something back, right? To defense. To what one person calls strike and retreat. They say something bad to you, boom, strike and retreat. So that you can hurt and leave. and get as much benefit as you can out of that moment. A tense situation can produce a flood of speech in that moment meant to project strength or in an effort to mitigate hurtful characterization. No, you don't understand. No, you don't understand. No, this is what I said. This is what I meant. I didn't mean that. Blah, blah, blah. Out it comes with a torrent of speech. We can be overstimulated by sound. That's not hard to do. To be overstimulated by sound, it can produce physical discomfort. Teresa and I once were gifted to go with somebody to listen to a Scottish folk band. And this is an internationally known group of musicians, and we got seated in the front row. Wonderful, it was great. It was great seats. We got seated right in front of the bagpipe with an amplifier. And so when they asked us later, how did you like the concert? We said, actually we didn't hear any of the concert. All we heard was, That's all we heard, was the bagpipe. The bottom drone of the bagpipe, that's it. We didn't hear, and it was physically discomfortable or uncomfortable. It was really awful, to be honest with you. So pain, it caused pain. Sounds can result in things like PTSD. I live out in an area of our county that people decide now is a good time to shoot, and so they'll go. Sometimes it's 9 o'clock at night, and this is a good time to shoot. I keep thinking that these people generally don't think about the fact that there are people in our world who really react to stuff like that. And that could be a problem. 4th of July is always a problem for these people. New Year's Eve, that kind of stuff. So it can trigger things like PTSD that trauma survivors experience. So sound can recall moments. It can lead to confused thought. It can obscure reality. It's not really what's happening. So sound can be beneficial but detrimental. And so we're aiming for integration and wholeness, and that's found, as we know, in the center of God's life. And disintegration then requires silence for restoration. For a moment, think about Elijah. And when you remember Elijah, what normally springs to mind? First thing springs to mind. Huh?
Challenge of the prophets.
Yes. The challenge of the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. That's the kind of pinnacle of Elijah's ministry that we all know about, right? And it was a time of great noise and cacophony because what was happening in that time? He let the prophets of Baal go first in the contest, right? And the Bible goes into some pretty incredible detail about what they did. And it sounds like they just got louder and louder and louder in order to bring about the desired effect. In vain. When it was Elijah's turn, he rebuilt the altar. He had him douse it 7 times with water, which, in a time of drought is pretty interesting. He had great confidence, right? So then he just quietly prays, or he just silently prays, or not loudly. He just prays, and boom. What happens next? He flees.
Almost dies.
Served,
and then
he flees because Jezebel says, well, this doesn't matter. I'm still going to cut your head off. Makes me feel better. So, so then what happens? He flees, and where does he go?
to the wilderness.
He goes to the wilderness.
The cave.
The cave, right. And then what happens? He's pretty depressed. Yeah, he wants to die. He's like, okay, I gave it my best shot, but evidently I'm just done. My use-by date has been reached, so I'm ready to go. And God has other plans for him. So God says, pay attention because I'm going to speak to you. And so Elijah gets this idea that God is going to speak. And then what we have is this series of dramatic moments, the fire, the wind, all this, the shaking, everything like that. What then happens? It's the silence. And in the silence, interesting thing, the Bible talks about in the silence, there is that moment when Elijah suddenly does what? in the silence, what does Elijah do? Do you remember?
Is that him shielding his face? Or?
Yeah, he covers his face. That comes back to the idea of, no man can see me and live, is the idea of Moses also. He covers his face because he knows God is present. And it's in that still, small voice of God. Some call it the gentle whisper. But Elijah knows it. He knows that voice. And it's in the silence that he hears it. And it's in the silence that he's restored and sent back to the next chapter of his ministry. So it's not in the cacophony, it's not in the noise, it's not in the activity, it's in the silence that Elijah is restored and brought back to wholeness and is able to hear then that voice of God and be reoriented to the mission and purpose of God. Where God essentially gently says, Elijah, this is not about you, dude. Because Elijah's like, what? I'm spent. I've done it. I've done all these great things. Boom. Whatever. And God's saying, you know what? I got 7,000 more. Just like you. So let's go. Let's do what's next. So Elijah is reoriented in the silence, in the quiet. Jesus is baptized by John in the wilderness. There's this incredible moment where the heavens, if you're reading the book of Mark, the heavens are torn open. That's interesting terminology. Heavens are torn open, and the voice of God comes, and this presence of God, symbolized by the dove, lands on Jesus. So this is an incredible identity moment where this voice from heaven says, you are my son in whom I am well pleased. This is a great pivotal moment. But what happens next? After this great moment?
Goes out into the desert.
Again, in the book of Mark, the Spirit drives Jesus out to the wilderness. That's interesting terminology. He drives Jesus out. So it's almost like you can't not go. Because our inclination might be, okay, John, what's the plan? Right? Let's get our heads together and see what we can do. So the Spirit separates him from that because this is a moment where Jesus assumes the ministry and the mission for which he was born and called to do. This is his calling. Off he goes into the wilderness for what? For quiet, for solitude, to be centered in the life of God. And if Jesus needed to be off in the wilderness in silence to be centered in the life of God, how much more, do we need stuff like that? We do. And so Jesus is out there centered, and he's thinking obviously about the heart of the Old Covenant law, because when at the end of his fast, he is allowed to face the tempter. And don't think that just happened accidentally. God didn't allow the tempter to come to him until the end of the fast. Why? Because that's when Jesus was at his strongest. Whenever we read that, we always think, well, he was very weak. That's why the devil came to him in that opportunity. But God didn't allow the devil to come to him until he was at his strongest. And that's when he was alive. Because what was his reply? He didn't even waver. He didn't even think about it. It was just, boom, automatic. And it came out of the heart of the Old Covenant law, Deuteronomy 5, 6, 7, and 8. That chapter, which forms just the core of Old Testament, of the Old Covenant understanding. Jesus was meditating on that because he responds from that to the tempter. And it's not even hard for him. It's not even hard. And so Jesus was at his strongest in that moment. Because why? Because he was moving into that public portion of his ministry that would, 3 years later, result in his death, and of course the resurrection. But all of the work leading up to that point, he needed to be very centered in the will of God, because there was going to be a lot of confrontation, a lot of disappointment, a lot of challenge, a lot of heartbreak. He needed to be in the center of God's will. And so he was out there silent and quiet. So, he does that to learn to recognize the voice of God. So how do we do that for ourselves? What are some practical helps and some potential outcomes? And not surprisingly, a lot of the same things that we talked about solitude apply to this, to silence. You find a place of relative quiet, get as quiet as you can. Apart from the regular persistent sounds that invade our spaces, nature works. Sometimes getting up earlier works. Sometimes in the middle of the night. I mean, get up in the middle of the night if that's, that can also work. Get an isolated spot in your home. Use noise-canceling headsets. Those will work. I have those. I've used them for this purpose before. Put your cell phone on silent. Vibrate if necessary. If you need to be contacted, for something, then put it on vibrate. If you can do without it, just do without it. Don't be distracted by anything. It should be obvious, but no music or podcast. This is not a time to, even Christian music. This is the time of silence. You should not engage with anyone. And so not speaking is part of it. But also not communicating, because we have a number of ways to communicate with people that don't involve speech these days. I was actually on a retreat. A week-long retreat. And part of this was a 48-hour of silence, built into the retreat. And and one of the retreatants was texting away. And later on, he confessed. He said, "Yeah, well, I was saying to my friends, well, we're in this moment of great silence, so I'm being silent, But what's happening, And it wasn't like, you missed the whole point."
It's a literal interpretation.
Yeah, he was very pharisaical about it. I did not speak. That's noise. So there we go. Don't speak. Don't say anything. Listen in the quiet. Be attentive to experiencing what's around you. It's a time of prayer, but not in the form of speaking to God, but rather listening to God and listening to what God might be saying to you. Again, don't bring a book you should read or plan or write. Just be alone in God's presence and let that thought guide you. And let perhaps Samuel's response kind of undergird and motivate you. Speak, Lord, for your servant is what? Listening. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Interesting that happens in the nighttime, doesn't it? There's a reason for that. So let go of distracting, intruding thoughts, so forth. So here's some outcomes that may happen, that you may experience. One, you may become bored, especially if you're an extrovert. Because extroverts do what? They're the life of the party. So you may get bored just by being by yourself and be quiet. It's okay. Learn to live with boredom. Boredom is not the worst thing that could happen to you. But that says something about you. So pay attention to what that says. You may actually become fatigued. You may find that when you get still and silent, what normally happens when you're still and silent? Yeah, you go to sleep. And it may catch up to you, because a lot of times, what do we do when we're feeling fatigued and tired? We just get further involved in what it is we're doing, and we drink more coffee, And we get up, we turn on the radio really loud, or whatever it is that we got to stimulate us. We get out and get things going. When it all shuts down, it all caves in. And you know what? If sleep is what happens, it's probably what you need. And it's okay. It's okay. Now, you shouldn't, probably spend the next 8 hours sleeping. But if you fall asleep, maybe you need the sleep more than you need, and God will catch you the next time. Or maybe God catches you in your sleep, At any point, you may fall asleep, you may become fatigued, and that also says something about your life. You may find it really difficult to be silent. You may find it really hard to be silent. How many times do you speak to yourself? Out loud. Or the dog or the cat or whatever. Yeah. So you may find it really difficult to be silent. So work at being silent. When you do, you may see and hear things you'd ordinarily miss. Pass right by. And it's okay, but you might see and hear things you'd ordinarily miss. Those are little gifts. You may discover how dependent you are on talking. Why are we so dependent on talking? A lot of times we're defending ourselves. We're manipulating situations. We're entertaining ourselves, by talking. Sometimes you may find it difficult to realize how dependent you are on talking, because talking controls a situation. All these unfortunate police encounters where they end up in death for a victim in that situation. What's incredible when you watch the body cams thing is how many commands the police are issuing in those moments. The one guy who died with the 7 police or 10, I think it was 7 officers responded. They counted in the tape. There were 73 commands given to that person in that moment. And many of them he could not comply with because it was physically impossible for him to do so. They were restraining his arms, and somebody was shouting, "Show me your hands." Well, how can you comply with that? You can't. 73 different commands. Imagine in the space of the short time that took, 73 commands. How could you even process that? 73 commands, okay? But what's happening? The police are taught to what? First thing, maybe you don't know this, you haven't been to police academy. First thing a policeman is taught, or a police officer is taught, is you control the situation. Isn't that right?
That's a big part.
It's a big part. You control the situation. You have to discover what it is. You control the situation. So they're controllers. Not because they feel like I'm the one with all the answers, but they're supposed to what? Keep the peace, right? And so part of it is you have to control the chaos that's happening in order to bring the peace. So they're taught to be controllers. You come in and control the situation. That's true in life for us. Many times we try to control the situations that we're in by speaking. And so we're dependent on that. So when you don't speak, you may feel powerless, vulnerable, helpless in a situation. Curtailing speech, though, can help you control your tongue with others. When you learn how to be silent, you really learn that you don't have to say anything. You don't have to. You may, but you don't have to say something. You'll learn how to recognize the voice of the Good Shepherd. We talked about this before in terms of curtailing your speech. It gives you a sense of the opportunity to pause before you respond, to give your sense a little bit of rest, a reset. What is my response? So when somebody says something, you don't instantly respond back, but you wait, process what's being said, and then you have a moment to say, okay, God, what does love call for in this situation? What is the best outcome here? And so you'll learn how to listen in that moment. When you're quiet, you learn to listen to other people. You listen. Sometimes in evangelism, when people are talking about it, we're doing all the talking, right? We're not doing any listening. We're not asking people about where they are, what they're saying. We're not hearing what they're not saying. We're just talking because we have a certain set of points to make. So maybe listening is more important. People today are just waiting for somebody to listen to them. And if we become those kinds of people, think about the inroads God can have in that moment if we become those people listening. But if we're busy talking, then we can't be those inroads. But in the silence, you'll discover the assurance of God's presence and love as you hear God speak to you, and then that'll help you avoid defensive posturing with others. Because when you're assured of God's love and care, then you don't need to defend yourself. It's like the whole apologist approach. We don't need to defend the faith defends us. And so when we're assured of God's love, we don't need to take on the battle. God, we know who counts. so that when you do speak in those situations, you'll be more conscious of its quality rather than its quantity. So what you do say will have more meaning to it because you've had time to think through with God about doing that. And then hearing God in silence will help you to hear God always. When you hear God in silence, you'll be able to hear God in the crowd. And that's the valuable asset we're looking for in this time.
Hey Frank, just real quick, a question I've commonly had when we talk about this topic, I'd ask myself, is when I do hear a voice in my head, how do I know that it's God as opposed to me or something else trying to distract me? And so I'm thinking that, as you say, this practice may help us, when I'm asking that question, recognize when is it God speaking as opposed to my self-interest or something.
There does come a time when you when you will recognize a voice distinct from your own. And sometimes it comes with a thought that begins at a point of departure you wouldn't consider. Or it will give you an insight that you wouldn't ordinarily arrive at, a conclusion for yourself. It'll be kind of a burst of insight. And, but it will take time before you have confidence in that voice. But when you do, then you will learn to listen for it in all that time. It's the best way I can explain it. Yeah. If it's accusing, criticizing, condemning, it's likely not God.
Unloving.
Yeah, unloving. It's likely not God. And if it puts you down or it criticizes you in a way that's unhelpful, then that's probably not God. But there comes a time when you will know that voice and have confidence in it. So, okay, that's all I got today.